Good. All right. Welcome, everyone. I want to say that all the presentations last week still on my mind. Really fantastic presentations. Really appreciate all the work that everybody did. I am going to actually try to pull some of those back into our discussion today as we go through today's material. Before we do that, I wanted to highlight just a couple things that came up. Not any one big issue, but a couple of news items that I thought were kind of neat that I wanted to show all of you. One of them, alerted to me by Tave here. This is a problem that you see all over the world. This is in Mexico, 450-year-old church that was inundated in a reservoir. Is now appearing because of drought, and this is a major issue all over the world where you're having drought, and the reservoirs that had been filled up 50 or 100 years ago are now revealing these old artifacts. And I suppose it's not a big deal, you know, it's kind of neat. You go look at these artifacts, but there's a question of whether they should have been inundated in the first place. And right now in Turkey, there's a major well, in Turkey it's not a controversy, but elsewhere around the world it is a controversy that Turkey is going to be flooding areas, ancient village locations that are 4,000 or 5,000 years old because they're building all these reservoirs in Turkey on the upper Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Same thing in other parts of the world, China.
They're doing that in Guanajuato.
They're doing that in Guanajuato? They're going to inundate what?
They're building a dam.
Yeah.
Too far away, and they're having issues with locals and having to move them and cemeteries.
In China, the Three Gorges Dam, this 300-mile river that they created, inundated hundreds and hundreds of archaeological sites, historical and cultural sites, and it's a major issue. Whether it's a good or bad, I leave that to somebody else to decide. But it's an issue that has been raised many places around the world. And so this one here is in Mexico, but even in our own Colorado River, right now where Lake Powell, Lake Mead are dropping, you're finding a lot of these old sites, some of these Native American sites that are now reappearing. And people are asking whether it was worth inundating them and covering them up and possibly destroying some of these archaeological sites. So I thought this was one interesting story. Speaking of Turkey, there's a real concern about the extent to which Turkey is constructing dams on the upper Tigris and Euphrates rivers. I think something like 25 or 30 large dams. Large dams means over 15 meters, 45 feet. And that will control a tremendous amount of water that would flow normally downstream into Syria and Iraq. And the question is whether Turkey might actually use these dams as a mechanism for conflict. And this was a lengthy story of a guy that was traveling in this region and writing about these the politics behind dam construction and the conflicts that are ongoing right now in the region. So water and dams as potentially as a weapon of war. This is something that's been addressed elsewhere and continues to be a concern around the world. So another interesting story, this one here, Chad and Nigeria and others are in danger because Lake Chad is drying up. And I think I mentioned Lake Chad the other day. But it's literally drying up. And so we're having, just like we had the Aral Sea, I talked to you guys about the Aral Sea, Lake Chad, the Dead Sea, Salton Sea in California, numerous other lakes around the world. This one's a transboundary lake. And so you have problems of water availability or lack thereof for the different countries that border this lake. There's even a question of where the boundary is, because the middle of the lake changes if the middle was in fact the boundary, but the middle location geographically can change based on how much water you have and depending what's the deepest and shallow parts of the lake. If it was a geographical boundary, then certainly those don't change, but there are many lakes where the boundary is actually either the deepest part of the lake or some other aspect in relation to the former shore. So a certain distance from a shore. Well, as the lakes dry up, the distance changes, and they move. And so this has caused a number of controversy around the world because of lakes drying out and rivers drying out too. Last story I wanted to highlight was this one. I'm sure you've been hearing about the climate change meetings that are ongoing, and one of the issues that has been raised is the fact that water has not been a major component of the agenda, which seems really odd because when you're talking about climate change, the very first impact you're going to have is on water. Either droughts or floods, sea level rise, everything is, all the impacts, the big impacts are going to be water related. And so this article in The Guardian was asking whether we need some kind of world monitoring or global monitoring system for drought. There was an interesting chart in here. Here we go. Let's see. It shows the state of drought around the world in August of 2015. And the question is, do we need to monitor this as droughts move around, as they increase or decrease, and whether we can try to start projecting this into the future? Right now, droughts are simply being monitored by the countries that have the resources to monitor them for themselves. Occasionally, some regions of Europe, some countries like the United States do monitor on a larger scale, regional or global scale, but there is no global organization that is trying to take account of all the activities, all the consequences, all the implications of drought that are occurring around the world. And again, it doesn't seem to be on the a main issue of the agenda in the climate change negotiations. So I thought these were particularly interesting topics. Anybody else see any kind of neat stories in the news last week? No one is reading the newspaper? Online? No?
Okay.
Just continuing drilling.
I got one that came out of. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I got one that came out of Reuters. It said governments must cooperate more in water hotspots to prevent conflict. But what was interesting, it said more than half the world's population depends on drinking water on rivers that flow from the Himalayan glaciers, which are melting at an accelerating pace. The other interesting thing was, although more than 200 water treaties have been negotiated between countries over the past 50 years, there's no agreements on how to manage 60% of the world's 276 transboundary rivers.
Yeah. Great points. The Himalayas, if you think about it, how many people live in India, live in China, in Pakistan, in where else? Afghanistan gets a little bit of water. Malaysia, no, not Malaysia. Can't think of the other countries in the region. All the countries on the Mekong. These are all coming from either in the Himalayas or right off the Himalayas, and we're talking about billions of people, billions with a B. And as the glaciers are dwindling, many of the studies are suggesting that they are starting to decline. Those are providing water down into all these major rivers coming out of the Himalayas, and there's disputes about the extent to which the glaciers are declining and how fast they're declining, but certainly can have huge implications on the billions of people that live in all those basins that are dependent on the Himalayas. What was the other topic you mentioned?
No, it's kind of tangentially.
But no, he had mentioned.
It actually pointed out that although there's more than 200 water treaties have been negotiated, 60% of the world's transboundary rivers have no agreement.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting statistics because you have to be careful with statistics. First of all these, when you say 60% of the world's rivers are not covered by treaties, that's absolutely true. The transboundary rivers, we have somewhere around 275 to 300 rivers that are transboundary, and the number varies depending on whether you count certain tributaries as independent transboundary rivers or not. But 60% do not have an agreement. Now, you do have to question whether some of these rivers need an agreement. Do you need to create an agreement where there's no conflict, there's no controversy? That's a sort of a political question. But most of the majority of rivers around the world that are transboundary don't have an agreement. You can actually describe this as even more challenging situation because even those rivers that do have an agreement, they don't include all the riparians. So in Europe, all the rivers that are transboundary include the riparians. North America, well, that's easy. We U.S. Canada, U.S. Mexico, that's all the riparians. When you get to Asia, when you get to Africa, there are many rivers that include only 2 riparians or 3 riparians on rivers that have 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 riparian states. And so really creates challenges in terms of trying to manage the entire river as a basin as opposed to one component of it. So great point. Patrick, you had something? No?
No.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other stories catch your attention? All right. Well, thank you for those stories. What I want to start...
I know this is
a
little, not really on topic, but what I've noticed is a lack thereof stories that are written about water. Like, I was reading an article today about a journalist in Texas and how he did a bunch of reportings over the drought in 2011, and he was talking about how no one is reporting on it. Like, that water is such an important resource, but yet it's not really on the news. And I thought that was a really interesting point, that this is a worldwide crisis, and yet no one's really paying attention to it. So that it's kind of off topic, but relevant at the same time.
No, absolutely on topic. Absolutely on topic. I think it's a great point, because you have to ask the question, is it the media's fault for not covering it, or is it people's fault for not paying attention or not being interested? Is this a marketing issue, the media only catering to the interest of what the types of stories that people are interested in? I don't know the answer. I can tell you that there are a couple of news sources that are water only. I've passed those around once or twice. USCA News and Global Water Intelligence are 2 news sources that do water only. But when you talk about the mainstream, The Guardian is actually fairly good. They have a water topic at least once a week, something global. Beyond that, you have to... It's not the major news stories, or news magazines or newspapers. It's usually the minor ones. Some in Africa, 1 or 2 in Asia, but yeah, not many journalists follow those.
Do you think that's a problem with culture or with media? Because we kind of like to read things that are shocking.
Yeah.
And I guess droughts, I'm assuming, take place over long periods of time.
Yeah. It could be. It could be. It could be the fact that we as consumers are not attuned to these kinds of longer-term water issues, except when the dam breaks. Construction of a dam takes 2, 3, 4 years, so it's a long-winded kind of story. When it breaks, it's immediate. So, yeah, possibly. I know that USCA News is trying to develop a journalist training program on water news, on what are the implications, but I don't know if that's gone very far, again, because I just don't see too many journalists are interested in it. So it's a really great point. Really great point. Anybody else?
I'd like to add on the news sources on water. There's also a U.S.-based organization which does pretty good reporting on water called Circle of Blue.
Yes.
They send they're actually journalists, so they do very well communicate a lot of the water news and.
No, they're excellent, and they only started a few years ago. And in the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, they've really grown in prominence and reputation. I think because they're one of the few organizations that is actually doing investigative journalism on water issues. So they're not just reporting; they're actually doing investigations and reports, in-depth reports that you just don't see elsewhere. So they've done a lot of great work. They're also pairing up with the Pacific Institute. They're pairing up with other organizations around the world to research these stories. So they've done very good stuff. What else? Anything else? All right. So let's start off with the case study on the Gabčíkovo-Nagymaros Dam dispute. This is part of the readings that you had today, so hopefully this will be understandable. We can digest it very quickly, the facts, and get to some of the legal issues here, because I do want to talk about what are the implications of this type of case for international water law. How do we resolve this kind of case? So let me just quickly summarize, and just for purposes of disclosure, I was a student research assistant for one of the attorneys representing Hungary in this case. So I tend to be a little biased just because of my past work on here, but I will try to present it as objectively as possible. All right, the Danube River flows through 10 countries. It's one of the river basins around the world that crosses almost the most number of countries of any other basin. 10 countries in a major, in the heart of Central Europe, going all the way to Eastern Europe. So this is a major artery for navigation, for commerce, for fishing, for commercial activities, recreational activities, and it has been managed in various forms through commissions and treaties and so on for about 150 or more years. So there's a lot of experience here amongst the countries in terms of cooperation. Looking a little closer, if you look, let me go back to this. If you look, let me see if you can see my cursor here. The focus of this particular dispute is right where Hungary and Slovakia intersect, which is right here in this area. So getting a little closer, this is this area that I was just circling on the prior map, and you can see that this river is a successive river and a contiguous river. So right here, you could see that it flows entirely inside of Slovakia. Then it forms the border, and then it flows entirely within Hungary. So it's both a successive and a contiguous river. So just a point of, I suppose, complication in terms of how we think about who has what responsibilities and who has what rights with regard to the two states. One of the problems with this particular region was that it was prone to flooding, and there was a few places where they had rapids, and so navigation was problematic, and they really wanted to, what they call fix this problem, this section of the river, so they can increase commerce, increase navigation, improve navigation, and this was particularly an important priority during the Soviet regime, when the Soviet Union effectively controlled Eastern Europe, especially in this particular region, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and so on. Under the old Soviet system, it was a command and control system, top down, and it was a centralized system. It was also centralized not just in each country, but as in the region as a whole. So with a support or direction of the Soviet Union, countries were directed to do certain things. One country, Central Asia became the cotton and part of the agricultural breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Eastern Europe became very important as an industrial area and as arteries to the West. So navigation and commerce were big priorities in this region. So in 1977, Hungary and Czechoslovakia entered into an agreement under the supervision of the Soviet Union to, quote unquote, fix the problem of the river in this area, improve navigation, and allow for more commerce back and forth. So here's just a timeline. 77, you have this agreement. They were actually going to work on some hydroelectric power development, flood management, improve navigation, promote economic development and commerce. If you remember, in 1980s, there was a lot of turmoil in Eastern Europe, and this is where Gorbachev in the Soviet Union came to power, in perestroika and glasnost, and a lot of these Eastern European countries became more empowered, and they felt the ability they can start making their own decisions. And Hungary decided to do so in the late 1980s by suspending the treaty. And they suspended it on grounds of ecological concerns, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. A few years later, Czechoslovakia began implementing an alternative because Hungary was no longer supporting their plans, and a few months later, Czechoslovakia split up into two countries, and Slovakia took on the treaty, the responsibilities of the treaty between former Czechoslovakia and Hungary. At this point, Hungary has renounced the treaty. Slovakia is trying to pursue the treaty in an alternative way, which I'll show you in a minute. And they were in a big dispute over the consequences of both countries' action. So what was the big deal? What they wanted to do was create a system of dams, and you can see these dashes. There's one over here in the Dunakility area. There's one here in the Gabčíkovo area, and one way down here in the Nagy Maros area. And what this was going to do, here the dashed line, you can see this is the border and the original channel of the Danube River. What they wanted to do was to dam the entrance to this section of the Danube River and divert it. This was the troubled section where shipping and navigation and commerce was problematic. They were going to dig a canal completely in Slovakia and go around the system, or at least the troubled part of the river, and thereby improve navigation, commerce, and so on. Between the three dams, what they were going to do was control how much water was going down the canal and into Danube River, so that they could manage it at different times of the year, increase the water, reduce the water, and have a continuous flow so that navigation would never have to stop. And they added some locks, both at, I think, Nagy Maros and at Gabčíkovo. They were going to add locks so that shipping can go up and down. Now remember, 1989, Hungary reneges on the treaty, and they say we're not going to continue with this project, even though they had already sunk millions of dollars at Nagy Maros to start building. I think they started also at Dunakility. So at this point, you can see that this dam here, Dunakility, was going to be crucial to diverting the river. And Slovakia wanted to continue with the project. So here's what they did. They moved the dam instead of constructing it at Dunakility, they constructed it upstream, entirely inside of Slovakia, at Kunovo. So this Dunakility would have been a transboundary dam. It would have been shared by both countries. What they did was they went entirely within Slovakia, diverted the river inside Slovakia, and then proceeded with the Gabčíkovo Dam. And the one at Nagymaros was never finished. That was going to be Hungary's responsibility. They were never going to finish it. So they were going to try to get at least some of the value of navigation and commerce and flood control. At least that was Slovakia's argument. Hungary wasn't too pleased at Slovakia's action, and they challenged Slovakia. Eventually they went to the World Court, the International Court of Justice, and they said, hey, we reneged on the treaty because of ecological necessity. These are all the allegations they brought up in terms of the potential impact that this diversion would have. The destruction of the Żygetkos wetlands, which is a major migratory bird location, and it was going to dry it up. And you can see that the water in the original channel, which is right next to the Żygetkos wetlands, was going to drop by 80%. They're forecasting all sorts of die-offs of species, aquatic and terrestrial species, and so on. They also argued change in circumstance, new environmental priorities. This is the 1980s. Soviet Union is now moving away. At least the yoke of the Soviet Union is now moving away, and so these Eastern European nations are recognizing environmental concerns that were recognized elsewhere around the world. The planned economy is being replaced by a market economy. And one more argument that I forgot to put on here, this whole diversion scheme, and you have the picture here of the Gabčíkovo Dam and how they diverted the water entirely in Slovakia, that's a violation of Hungary's sovereignty. All that the river, the border river that they've now dried up, that's an infringement of their sovereignty. That's what Hungary alleged. In response, Slovakia argued ecological necessity was not applicable here because it was not imminent. It was not serious. It was projected, it was forecasted, but it wasn't definitive. And even if it was definitive, it wasn't really as bad as the Hungarians claimed. They also said that the change in circumstances is not a serious enough issue to void the treaty or to allow Hungary to renege on the treaty. And then it said, sort of a counter-argument, Hungary violated its treaty obligations by canceling the treaty. And if you think about it, are you allowed to just cancel outright your apartment lease? No. Are you allowed to enter in can you enter in a contract to buy, for goods or services, and then I don't want to do it anymore? You can't just walk away. That's what Slovakia was saying, and it was in violation of its treaty. And Slovakia said that this variant, this alternative that they came up with, which is called Variant C, was justified because they had to mitigate the damages that Hungary caused when they exited the treaty. So these are the allegations. This is what actually went to the International Court of Justice. Court is requested to decide on all these issues, whether Hungary was entitled to suspend the treaty and eventually abandon it, whether Slovakia was entitled to proceed with its alternative, which, remember, was entirely inside Slovakia when it diverted the Danube River. And then lastly, the effect of the treaty, again, relating to the first point, which is whether Hungary was able to terminate the treaty. And then the court, they asked the parties to determine the legal consequences of all of these effects. In the International Court of Justice, when countries go in front of the court, they go voluntarily. So they have to voluntarily propose what issues the court is going to address. They can't just leave it up to the court. The World Court is not a compulsory court. You can't be compelled to go there. You have to volunteer to go to the court. These countries went voluntarily between them. So, What do we do here in this kind of dispute? What are the issues? You've got upstream, downstream concerns. You've got one country that wants to divert the river because the other one doesn't want to continue with a series of dam projects. So you have upstream, downstream because it is a successive river, but you also have left bank, right bank. It's a contiguous river. What would be the factual issues here, or factual concerns? Those are all the ones I showed you, right? All the allegations, the harm. So now, what are the legal concerns?
Okay. Has the beneficial use been established by the diversion?
When you say has the beneficial use been established, what do you mean by established?
Has it been defined to where the beneficial use could be identified?
Well, sure. So this was defined by the treaty, that the purpose of the treaty was to improve navigation, enhance commerce, flood control, all these kinds of things. These were, the engineers developed these projects, and that's what Slovakia was saying would happen if they were allowed to proceed with the original plan. And under this variant plan, it wouldn't have the same amount of benefits, but they were trying to save as much of the possible benefits without Hungary's participation, because Hungary wasn't going to participate. So they were trying to mitigate the damages that Hungary was causing. Why would it be important to know about these potential benefits?
Go ahead. You're on.
There needs to, the offset, in other words, if the benefits have been identified, then I would have thought that there would have been a distinct ruling from the court as to whether or not Hungary agreed and accepted those benefits.
Okay. And in fact, the court said that Hungary violated the treaty by reneging on it. Not necessarily in relation to the benefits, but just by breaking the treaty. It's a contract between countries. But why would the benefits here be an issue? You suggested to offset them against what was in the treaty, right?
Right.
What else would you try to offset them against?
The ecological impacts.
What about the potential negative impacts of implementation of the treaty? Would you want to offset them against the benefits versus the potential harms? Or I should say the potential benefits versus potential harms? Does it matter that the benefits were forecasted in 1977, 1980 when they started construction, but the potential harms weren't conceptualized until the late 80s?
I would say it would be worth looking at the possible benefits versus the possible issues with the implementation of the treaty.
But what about the fact that the potential issues, the potential harms, weren't determined until 10 years after the treaty was signed?
I think that should be taken in consideration, I think that everything should have been reevaluated when they went to court, the international court.
Okay. Think about this in terms of you entering into a contract to do something in your home, to build something on your property, build a shed. You bring in an engineer or a home builder, say, I want to build a shed over there in the backyard. Yeah. And at some point after you start construction, you realize that that construction is going to cause some kind of environmental harm. Can you just tell the contractor, the builder, sorry, go away. We can't do anything. We're going to stop.
I feel like that Hungary was negligent if they went through a proof of benefit and Hungary did not do their due diligence to determine that, and then 10 years later they just show up and say, well, by the way, you need to look at these things. That to me is a demonstration of the fact that they weren't in the negotiation or weren't involved during the beneficial use statements.
Okay. That's exactly what Slovakia argued. What about the fact that Hungary was overseen by the Soviet Union and essentially directed to do this? Does that matter?
Now we're back to guns again.
This is the tough case. This is a very tough case. Let's go in terms of what are the legal issues here in terms of the two countries, Slovakia and Hungary. Break it down to really basic legal issues. What do you think is at issue here? What's at stake?
Well, the benefits had to be tied to some sort of economic value, so there's no question with what was listed as a benefit. There is a lot of economic deprivation that would occur without these improvements or without this diversion.
Okay, but if Hungary was saying that all these benefits will result in harm to their country, how do you characterize that harm? Remember, we're not talking about people here. We're not talking about corporations here. We're talking about countries. Countries are supposed to be independent actors, sovereign, and when somebody from outside that sovereign territory does something that affects something inside their sovereign territory, that's an infringement on sovereignty. Right? It's like you have two neighbors, and one neighbor decides to cut his tree down, and it falls on your land. Who's responsible for getting the tree out of there? Off your land. What if the tree hits your house? Who's responsible for that?
It's a negligence action.
Okay. Well, do we have international negligence? Not really. We don't. We don't have any kind of negligence.
Didn't you say that this was done without Hungary being involved in the participation of the discussion and the deal, and that the Soviet Union said, "Thou shalt do this"? Was it Hungary or was it the other country?
Well, if you study the way the Soviet Union interacted with its neighboring countries in Eastern Europe, you know that they did give them some measure of independence, and that is how each of those countries maintained their UN status and had an independent vote at the UN throughout the time that you had the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union did allow them to participate and negotiate their own treaties. But at the same time, the Soviet Union was very influential in the entire Soviet bloc region. And so the extent to which the Soviet Union dictated versus nudged them along, there's a lot of space in there, dictating, nudging, but we can only speculate how much influence they exerted to have the Czechoslovakia and Hungary develop this treaty. Slovakia, successor to the treaty on their side, wanted to continue with it. Hungary did not. What do you do?
Well, they went to the UN for resolution, and it was kind of disappointing the way the UN just basically said you guys need to get along.
Well, first of all, it's to the World Court, which is not necessarily, it's independent of the UN, though it's chartered by the UN, but UN General Assembly. So I just want to make sure that the World Court is not a direct arm of the UN. They're not controlled. The World Court is not controlled by the UN. Secondly, the question is, does the World Court have authority to give a more directed outcome to a case like this? What would they need to do, or what would they need to have? What kind of tools would they need to have a more the type of answer or outcome that you are seeking?
Enforcement authority.
What's that?
And they'd have to have enforcement authority, wouldn't they? Enforce their rulings?
Well, sure. But before you even get to that point, what would they need to have to make a decision?
Jurisdiction, I guess.
Jurisdiction, okay. Jurisdiction they had because both countries volunteered to give up their independence in front of the court. But what else?
So if they're not a compulsory court, then what are? I mean,
it's a voluntary. It's voluntary appearance.
Is it voluntary until you get an answer that you don't want?
The U.S. has taken that tact, actually. Other countries have been more amenable to the court's decisions.
Yeah.
But what else does the court have to make a decision in a particular case? Come on, law students. Real basic. How about law?
Oh yeah, that's an important part.
You've got to have international law that says, how do we deal with this upstream, downstream, or contiguous or successive situation? One country has, we have a treaty, and a country wants to renege on the treaty. You have potential environmental harm, and the other country says, no, you don't. You need to have some kind of law on this. Remember, we're talking about sovereign nations in a system where we don't have a court with an enforcement mechanism, where we don't have an international government, where we don't have an international police force. What kind of law do we have? Well, we started talking about this absolute territorial sovereignty and absolute territorial integrity, and we said, hey, these absolutes, they don't seem to work. Maybe if we're talking about, a really powerful country and a really weak country, and that's just, negotiating with an iron fist. But that's not always the situation in Europe. The countries are a lot more closer to each other in terms of economics and other issues. Even U.S., Canada. So what law do we have, or have we developed, to address these kinds of dispute? Slovakia and Hungary, we don't have a powerhouse here in an inferior country in terms of economic might or political might. They're pretty equal. What do we do?
Is there a customary law where they can look at other examples throughout the world?
Well, absolutely. And so the question is, what is that law? That's what we're looking for. Remember, we talked about no absolutes. What was the alternative to the absolutes?
Interest.
One was community of interests. Good. What was the other one? There are two alternatives to the two absolutes.
Wasn't one limited
Absolute.
sovereignty?
Yes, thank you. Limited sovereignty, an approach where countries, because they're both sovereign, because they are supposed to have, absolute sovereignty on their territory, but that's incompatible sometimes with their neighbors when we're talking about a transboundary natural resource. So both countries have to reduce their level of sovereignty to some extent, and that's what we call limited sovereignty. So these two alternatives, one is limited sovereignty and one is community of interest. How would you define the two? What's the differences? How would you contrast them? No thoughts on this? This is from this last week's reading and the weeks before. Community of interest. What does that mean to you?
It means that everyone in the water course works
Louder.
together. Just means that everyone in the water course works together.
Okay, so everybody. Okay, everybody works together. Mutual benefit. What?
Balancing benefit and harm.
Balancing benefits and harm. Good. How is that different from limited sovereignty?
Oh, wait, still me?
Sure.
So limited sovereignty would be when you had partial sovereignty over the water course that was running through your territory and had some rights to it, versus in a community that if someone downstream did more, then you wouldn't have rights to it there.
Okay, but in a community example, you're managing that water course collectively.
Yes.
And sovereignty is arguably even further diminished because you're no longer taking sovereignty into account. You're trying to balance benefits, harms. You're trying to optimize management of the river. So if this particular river, the best optimal use is to have dams all upstreams and very little water downstream, that's under a community approach, that's the community decision. In a limited sovereignty approach, you have more sovereignty than community approach, but not to the level of absolute. You have to look at this sort of on a continuum. On one end, you have absolutes, and the other end, you have community approach. And call it socialism, if you want. You know, a socialist approach to a river basin, where you're balancing everything, benefits, harms, and so on, and deciding the best use of that river collectively. Somewhere in the middle is a limited territorial sovereignty where you're not deciding it collectively, but you're not arguing for absolute sovereignty. You're limiting your sovereignty, and you're recognizing the other country's sovereignty. Not necessarily cooperating, but you're recognizing that other countries have sovereignty. Does anybody give me an example of community approach? Anybody can think of any place around the world where we're doing this? I think there's a couple of good examples, but have to think about it. Where are we looking at river basins as an entire basin and managing it collectively?
Well, the Plata, the upper Plata has a potential for community type negotiation because of the limited resources that they have.
Okay. How many countries are on the upper portion of the Plata?
There's 3.
Okay. So if you think about places where they have a small number of countries, it's easier to negotiate some kind of collective agreement. I'll give you an example. U.S. and Canada on the Columbia River. You got 2 countries. We've built dams in Canada that in the U.S., we paid for the dams in Canada because of the benefits that they are providing both Canada and the United States. Hydroelectric, flood control, and other aspects of that they've decided are benefits. So that's one river basin that arguably is in this sort of community approach. Europe, not all the rivers, not the Danube, probably not the big rivers that have 9 or 10 countries, but some of the smaller, the Mosel River, the Elbe, a couple other ones where you only have a couple of rivers, and they have taken more of a communitarian, collective management approach. But that's about it. Not many examples. So we don't have a lot of precedents. How about, so that's one extreme. How about the absolute examples? Where have we had examples of absolute management? Any examples? One from last week? Is that?
In China, absolute.
The Mekong River. Possibly you can make an argument that China is taking an absolute territorial sovereignty approach. It's building all these dams upstream with little consultation with its downstream neighbors. And in fact, China is one of the 3 countries that voted against the UN Watercourses Convention. Turkey might be another example. And by the way, they also voted against the UN Watercourses Convention. And the 3rd country was Burundi. They're not doing too much in terms of water management and development right now. But that's really the only countries I can think of, the only river basins where I can think of you've had absolute territorial arguments still being pursued. So we've only got 2 examples on the absolute side, a small handful on the community side. What about the rest of the world? Because we do have hundreds of treaties all over the world. They're all somewhere in that middle part, that limited territorial sovereignty. Because if you think about 2 countries or 3 countries or 5 countries getting together and saying, we're going to allocate this much water to you and this much to you, or you can build your hydroelectric dam if we can build our irrigation diversion canals. These are the treaties that we have right now. And they recognize some sovereignty that other riparians on the river have. That's where we stand right now in terms of the sovereignty issue. All right. How do you implement limited territorial sovereignty? Treaties, good. If you had to look at all these treaties and say the general rule from all these hundreds of treaties, what is the general rule? This week's reading.
Balancing benefit and harm.
What's that?
Balancing benefit and harm.
Balancing benefits harm, that's part of it. What was the principle called?
The equitable and reasonable utilization.
Equitable and reasonable utilization, yeah. When you look at all these treaties and all these actions, and you know that you have only a few examples on the absolute side and only a few examples on the community side, all these other treaties, hundreds of treaties and hundreds of case studies are right in the middle there. You have to try to figure out what rules are they using. It's really hard to come up with definite rules. So what we come up with is these more generic rules like equitable and reasonable utilization.
Before we move on, are there any
Yeah.
studies that have compared the absolutes and the community theory and the limited sovereignty, and have they looked at compared and contrast the success of each of those?
That's a great point. The absolute ones, I don't think so. At least I would say not an academic look at the absolute examples. Turkey will show you a lot of great examples of how wonderful their actions are and how beneficial it is, and the same with China. But I don't know if anybody's looked at it objectively, because Iraq, Vietnam, all the downstream states, and many researchers around the world will show you lots of studies that show how this is such a horrible, horrible approach. And it's not equitable, it's not fair, and it's not productive. So on the absolute side, I don't think there's been an objective study that has been done on that. I'm not sure it's possible to do an objective study, but maybe. Yeah.
Did they ever compare guess like the transboundary relationships between states, and then kind of extrapolate that internationally. So if you think about like,
what do you mean?
Like Tennessee and Georgia, you know, with the other, Florida, they kind of had that big transboundary
and extrapolate it into the international.
Yeah, and see if there's any kind of underlying themes that.
Where do you think the notion of equitable and reasonable came from?
Yeah, I was wondering why that happened.
Well, it's in the reading, this week's reading. If you know anything about the development of equitable apportionment in the United States, which is federal law, it's an outgrowth of U.S. Supreme Court jurisprudence. It's an outgrowth of jurisprudence from other federal systems like Switzerland. And they have developed the notions of equity as between their cantons. In the U.S., it's between states. And international law, when they saw these disputes, going back to the early 1900s, they borrowed from the federal systems, like the United States and Switzerland and a few others. So equitable and reasonable utilization really is an outgrowth, I think most especially out of the U.S. system, the federal system. Where was I before that? Forgot where I was. Studies. Okay, so we talked about absolutes. What's that?
How would you get an objective study? Was what you left on? Maybe you had concluded that it was impossible to do that at the Turkey dam building and those other places. Maybe was it your final word that would be impossible to do?
I would trust you to do the study. The problem is, could you get the data?
Yeah.
That's the challenge here. And that's why I'm a little skeptical about whether it can be done fully, because to get all the data from Turkey or China on the upper Tigris and Euphrates and on the upper Mekong, I think it's going to be a challenge. If you could get that information, and then I think we could do those objective studies.
I don't think you couldn't get the data, and you probably, unless you were independently wealthy, you couldn't get the money to conduct the study, could you?
That's part of the challenge.
Yeah,
that's part of the challenge. That's why I'm skeptical about doing objective studies on the absolutes. Now, on the other side, the community approach, there are quite a number of studies on the Columbia River, and they've presented this as almost a model river for many other parts of the world. We've had studies done on the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm not sure that's quite a community approach, but we certainly have the International Boundary Waters Commission, which operates very communally in terms of having the two sections cooperate, coordinate, and develop amendments, what we call minutes, to the 1944 treaty between U.S. and Mexico in a very community fashion. Europe, there's been numerous studies done on the rivers in Europe and characterized as a community approach. So we do have studies on those. And for the most part, the outcomes, the results are, why isn't the rest of the world following suit? That's the outcome of most of these studies. These are great results, but the rest of the world doesn't seem to want to follow suit. Why don't you think the rest of the world is? Why aren't we doing that?
Local political and cultural differences.
Local political cultural differences. What else?
I would suppose that some countries would be hesitant to give up some of their sovereignty.
That's exactly right. If you look at the Nile River, where Egypt has been using the majority of the volume of the water for thousands of years, and now has to recognize all the upstream rights, I'm not so sure that they're well, I know they're not willing to do that right now, because they would have to reduce their sovereign right or sovereign claim to the natural flow of the river into their country. So between these concerns about sovereignty, and then you have all these cultural differences and political differences, whether it's in Africa or you have cultural differences in terms of different tribes and different religions and all sorts of other differences, it makes for cooperation a very, very challenging situation. So we're back to limited sovereignty as what the majority of the world does. They recognize the fact that they can't have absolute sovereignty. They don't want to go to the other extreme of community, so they're willing to recognize some measure of sovereignty in the other countries, and sometimes they'll actually enter into treaties to that effect. But where exactly that line is in terms of how limited is their sovereignty, every situation is a little bit different. The question is, can we characterize them collectively in some way? And that's where we get to one of the main rules of equitable and reasonable utilization. There's one other rule highlighted in the readings for today that has been also characterized as part of this limited sovereignty, and that's the no significant harm rule. Beyond those two rules, you also have notions of obligations to cooperate, which, if you think about, limited territorial sovereignty suggests some measure of cooperation. So the question is, how much cooperation do you have to give? And that's debatable. And then the other aspects of this limited territorial sovereignty I'll talk about next class, because that it gets into procedural cooperation and procedural aspects of implementing the limited territorial sovereignty. So I want to stay on these. Equitable and reasonable use and no significant harm are what we call substantive rules, because you implement them not as necessarily as a process, but as a law. And if you violate them, it's violating a substantive obligation. So start off with equitable and reasonable utilization. What does it mean? When you have an obligation to be equitable and reasonable in the use of a transboundary watercourse, what does it mean? Let me ask it this way. Was Slovakia equitable and reasonable when it diverted the river on its own from the main channel?
No. Because it infringed on the rights of the co-riparian.
Okay. No, because it infringed on the rights of Hungary, you're saying. Okay.
So it infringed on their equitable interest.
Okay. What was the equitable interest here?
Reasonable share and benefit from that waterway.
All right. Let's break this down. What does equity mean? What does equity mean?
Ownership.
Not ownership, because equity, when something is equitable, what does it relate to?
Doesn't mean equal.
It doesn't mean equal. Good. That's one. Excellent. So we're not about equal. It's not equal rights. It's equitable rights. What else does it mean then, if it's not equal?
Divisible?
Potentially, that it could be divided somehow. But again, then we can say, well, it's divided up equitably. But what does that mean?
There's a history of that word associated with being fair, right?
How about that? How about dividing it up in a fair manner? How about allocating the watercourse fairly? And I think equitably does mean fairly. You can even describe it as maybe justice, whatever justice means. But it's whatever equitable means, right? It's equitable. It's a sense of fairness. It's a sense of right and wrong. We're still not sure where that line is, but it's a fairness allocation.
So does that imply that there has to be an agreement on what equitable means in that situation?
That's a great point. Is equity the same on the Mekong as it would be on the Danube, as it would be on the Nile River? What would you have to know to determine how to determine equity on the Mekong versus the Nile versus the Danube?
All the different factors.
What factors?
I mean, economics, environment, social factors.
Yeah.
System.
So our general rule is equity and fairness, but what that means in any particular river is going to be very river-specific. Economic issues, geographic issues, cultural issues, social issues, the needs, economic development, the rate of development, environmental concerns, climatic concerns, all these factors. And if you look on the UN Watercourses Convention, I'll pull that up in just a minute. Article 5, let's see, here we go. Okay, so here's the UN Watercourses Convention, and Article 5 says that a watercourse state shall, in their respective territories, utilize an international watercourse in an equitable and reasonable manner. Okay, that's our general rule for managing an international watercourse. If you look at Article 6, here are some of the factors relevant to determining what it means equitable and reasonable utilization. So geographic, hydrographic, social, economic, population dependent on the watercourse. Effects of the use.
Like existing use, like any sort of prior appropriation type.
Oh, that's a great point. What about prior uses versus future desired uses? Absolutely. What does that make the determination of equitable and reasonable if you're considering past uses and future uses? What does it do to the analysis of equitable and reasonable utilization? This is where Egypt gets really upset. Don't populations change? Don't economics change? Don't water uses change? So what do you think about this notion of equitable and reasonable utilization? It's going to change, right? It's going to be a dynamic assessment. So what may be equitable and reasonable today may not be tomorrow. And it's not necessarily in one day. Well, we're usually talking years and years. So it may have been equitable and reasonable for Egypt to use 80% of the Nile River for the last 4,000 years because nobody upstream was using it or needed to or claimed to use it. In the last 30, 40, 50 years, the populations upstream on the Nile have grown and expanded. They've developed. They're now in need of more fresh water. They have a sovereignty. They have a claim on the water, and they have some kind of right to the water. What is that right? Well, it's equitable and reasonable use. And the analysis that we did on equitable and reasonable use on the Nile River 100 years ago is a completely different analysis today because of the different factors that we take into account. Let me break down just a little bit equitable as opposed to reasonable. What are we looking at as equitable versus what are we looking at as reasonable? And I know those of you in College Station and Galveston, this is where we get into the real legalese stuff. And this is what the lawyers are doing when they're negotiating these treaties and figuring out what words to use. And then, or when they go to court and figuring out, well, this is what the treaty says or this is what international law says, and we have to figure out, did Slovakia violate Hungary's equitable and reasonable use, or did Hungary violate Slovakia's equitable and reasonable use of the Danube?
So does reasonable, does that refer to like the use and looking at the factors relative to each other, but equitable means more like the end allocation, I guess?
The reasonable part is about the types of uses.
And comparing it, I guess?
In comparing the types of uses, yes. And the example, when we talk about water law, when I teach U.S. water law, when something is reasonable or unreasonable, I usually do it in beneficial use. Drowning gophers. Okay? Is that a reasonable use of water? Flooding your field for the purpose of drowning gophers. There's actually a case like this about 80 or 100 years ago here in the U.S. And the court said, you know what? It might be effective. That's a completely unreasonable use of the water. So is that use reasonable for hydroelectric production, for irrigation, for drinking, for navigation, all those kinds of things? It's going to depend on the circumstances of that river. So that's the reasonable part. How about equitable? Somebody said division. Somebody said division of something. What are we dividing?
Equitable between the parties, and then the individual's parties use can be looked at as whether it's reasonable.
Right, so the actual use of the activity is reasonable, but what are we actually dividing?
Well, you could look at it as a benefit. You're dividing benefits, right?
Yeah. This is the part that's gotten a little controversial. Are you actually dividing the water equitably? Remember the article I sent around the end of right after class last week? That was proposing to divide the benefits in some fashion. And the example I've given is the Columbia River, where we've actually built these dams in Canada. And in a sense, we've allocated all this water to Canada. But the benefits that we in the U.S. get from flood control and a controlled flow is a tremendous value in the United States. So that's an example of equitable allocation of the benefits, not the actual water. States are still debating whether that equitable allocation should be the water or the benefits. Because when you're starting to allocate benefits equitably, it sounds like you're using some kind of community approach. And remember, that's on the other side of the spectrum, and a lot of countries just don't like to be that far because you're giving up sovereignty over that water that's flowing inside or along your border. So, big debate on equitable allocation. Reasonable, we're pretty comfortable with saying it's the actual use. And then we have all these factors that we take into account in terms of determining what it means. How about no significant harm? What does that mean? Because that's the other main substantive aspect of limited territorial sovereignty. Just think about it from the term, no significant harm. What does it mean?
So for example, if that canal that Slovakia built when they diverted the river totally dried up the original...
Oh no. Did we just lose you?
I didn't step on anything.
It's okay. Okay, College Station, are you guys still there?
Yes, we're here.
That's you.
Okay. Galveston, are you guys there?
Are they figuring us out?
All right, class canceled.
I'll just freeze it one. Tequila.
Well, if the tech guys at College Station, hopefully you guys can work on getting... Oh, are you guys back? All right, good, excellent. So you were saying about the diversion canal that Slovakia built, and you were asking about its impact on Hungary.
Right, so there were people, farmers, industries municipalities who were dependent on that water, and now it's no longer there. That was a large geographic area that was covered. There would be significant harm in my opinion.
Okay, good. So now, how do we have to measure significant harm in relation to whom?
Right. That's part of the problem. You have to define what harm is, and then you have to define what is the threshold for significant versus insignificant.
Excellent. Who are the parties here?
Co-riparians.
It's the states. The states are the parties. So when we're talking about harm, it's harm to the states. We have all these farmers and all these landowners, all these users, individuals who may be harmed. But under international law, they don't have standing. Only countries have standing. And so the harm has to be to the country. So we have to define that in terms of significant, that threshold has to be to the country itself. And as you said, what exactly is harm? How do we define those kinds of notions? If you're looking at a country and you're suggesting somebody caused our country harm, what would you look to explain that?
I would say if my country was prohibited from the equitable utilization of our water.
So if you weren't able to equitably use that water, that could be a harm? Good. So that's a harm to your right. Good. So from a legal point of view, your rights can be harmed. What else? Think about those farmers. Think about those people. What collectively can we say is being harmed?
Talking like an economic, monetary harm?
Sure, the economy of the region, or the economy of the country is harmed. How about the health of the people collectively, not individuals, but as a collective population? You can have a health impact that's caused harm. Environmental harm, that's a new one that's been recognized in the last couple of decades. Again, it's got to be collective. Now, the big question is, what's the threshold? At what point does it become significant? And I will tell you that when they negotiated these concepts, they used words like substantial harm, significant harm, appreciable harm. There's about 2 or 3 other words that they came up with and they evaluated, and they ended up with significant. Why? Whatever their collective decision-making based on examples around the world, they decided that significant was the threshold. Now you have to think about how would you rank appreciable, significant, substantial, or any other descriptor that you would use. It's not easy. It's not easy, but whatever is significant, that's the threshold you have to figure out. That when you go to court, that's what you're going to have to present the evidence to prove to the judges that it exceeded significant harm. And in the Watercourse Convention, again, we're looking at generic rules and generic statements of the law. It just says, obligation not to cause significant harm. Watercourse states shall, in utilizing an international watercourse in their territory, shall take all appropriate measures to prevent the causing of significant harms to other watercourse states. So that's the statement they've come up with as international law and what they put in the Watercourse Convention. Yeah.
So I guess in America we talk a lot about like the hierarchy and domestic use being the most important.
Right.
Did they put anything in there about, like, I guess, use for human?
Yeah, well, there is one place in... Here we go. Look at Article 10. Relationship between different kinds of uses. In the absence of an agreement, okay, we don't have a treaty or anything, or custom to the contrary. If you can show something in customary law, no use enjoys an inherent priority over another use. Except that, look at 2. In the event that a conflict between uses of an international watercourse, it's going to be resolved with reference to Article 5 on equitable and reasonable utilization and Article 7 on no significant harm, with special regard being given to the requirements of vital human needs. Except, what's vital human needs? It's not defined. So
Really? They didn't define that?
they did not define it, no. So the question is, do you use the World Health Organization standards of the minimum amount of water you need to survive, which is supposed to be, I think, 50 liters per person per day? Of course, you know, if you live in, I don't know, Alaska or Alberta, the amount of water that you need to exist is going to be probably a little bit less than if you live in sub-Saharan Africa. So what is vital human needs? All of these factors, remember, they're generic. But that's because what applies to the Rio Grande in the really dry part of the world is going to be very different than what applies to the Zambezi, which is a lot wetter region of the world. So vital human needs, what is significant harm, is going to be different. Giving you another example, the Tigris and Euphrates are 2 very different rivers. If I remember correctly, the Tigris River gets smaller as it reaches its mouth. Most rivers start small and get bigger, right? I think the Euphrates River follows that model because you have tributaries. It goes through the desert, but there's enough tributary water adding to it before it gets to the Gulf. The Tigris River is the exact opposite because of evaporation. I know one's one, one's the other. I don't remember Tigris or Euphrates, but it actually loses its volume as it flows downriver, which is not the typical thing. So the question is, what is significant harm on the Tigris versus significant harm on the Euphrates? What is equitable and reasonable on the Tigris is going to be different than what is equitable and reasonable on the Euphrates, which is going to be different from the Mekong, which is going to be different from the Nile, which is going to be different from any other river around the world. All right. We got a little bit of idea of these general rules under the context of limited territorial sovereignty. Let me ask you, if you're an upstream country, do you have a preference as between these 2 rules? If you're a downstream country, do you have a preference between these 2 rules?
It seems to me that the upstream riparians would be more concerned with significant harm because they would want to use as much as they could without causing significant harm, whereas the downstream riparians would be more concerned with equity because they want their fair share.
Well, if you think about what you just said about the upstream nations, they're concerned about their use so that they don't cause significant harm. Mm-hmm. Most countries aren't thinking about will they cause harm. They just want to use. Okay. I think you're thinking about it exactly correctly, but I would reverse it about the downstream state thinking about they're concerned about significant harm, the harm that the upstream country will cause them. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And the upstream countries tend to be more concerned with equitable and reasonable use. Not that they're being equitable and reasonable, but the downstream country, you guys must be equitable and reasonable and allow us to use the amount that we need to use. And again, the downstream users are concerned about upstream users causing harm. Is there a conflict here? Is there conflict? Could you have countries being equitable and reasonable but causing significant harm? Think about it this way. Let's say we have a country upstream, very poor, not very developed, no other water resources except this one transboundary river. The downstream country has other water sources. They're developed. They have lots of money. Would it be inequitable to take 75% of the water and allocate, or at least allocate the benefits of the upstream country to the needy country? Would it be inequitable, or would it be equitable? Especially if the downstream country has all other water resources, right? But could it cause significant harm if you take 75% of the water out? Yeah. So we may have a potential conflict here. And you can actually make the argument the other way too. Could significant harm be inequitable, or could it be equitable? Could you actually cause significant harm and it still be equitable, or can you actually cause significant harm and it be inequitable? So what do you have? What do you when you have two countries arguing these opposing types of arguments? And McCaffrey actually he disagrees with me in the way I'm presenting this. He thinks that they're very compatible. Most countries don't look at it this way. They look at it as upstream, everybody must be equitable and reasonable. Downstream, hey, you can't cause a significant harm. And they're setting themselves up for a conflict. Let me point you to the UN Watercourses Convention and what was written here. And this is a very controversial issue. Article 10, Section 2, in the event of a conflict between uses of an international... no, I'm sorry. I'm in the wrong article. Hold on. Article 7. Yes, obligation not to cause significant harm, Section 2. Where significant harm nevertheless is caused to another state, the state that's causing that harm shall, in the absence of an agreement, take all appropriate measures having due regard for the provisions of Articles 5 and 6, which are all about equitable and reasonable utilization. So, law students, reading that, how do you interpret the language? Anybody else want to take a crack? Look at the language here.
It says shall, so I guess presumably is making them do something.
Okay, but where's the shall? They shall take
all appropriate measures.
Take all measures. Keep going.
In consultation with the affected state.
You skipped the part.
Due regard for the provisions of Articles 5 and 6.
What does that mean?
It means we're back where we started.
Well, if you have a conflict between a state arguing significant harm and a state arguing equitable reasonable utilization, Article 7 on no significant harm says you must do something about the harm that you're causing with due regard to equitable and reasonable utilization. Suggesting maybe that equitable and reasonable utilization is more important. And that significant harm maybe even becomes another factor.
Okay. Go forward, do great things.
It's getting worse as the weeks go on.
Pretty soon.
Dr. Tom, are you comfortable with my topic?
Did we just lose somebody?
That sounds good to me. Send it to him. Tell him this story. Okay. Send it to him.
Galveston. Hey, Galveston.
Everybody is. You need to fix yours. Your topic.
I thought I sent you an email.
Maybe you did. I haven't looked at it.
Oh, the Ogallala.
I think
What's going on?
their connection again. So
Other
that's why they're
We got one-way connection, I guess.
Yeah, but now they're back. I think they don't realize it.
Foreign world.
I'll get specific between classes.
Okay, and you
Hey,
sent
Galveston.
me yours
Can you hear us?
Epstein has yours, Epstein has yours. What have you done?
Hey, we can hear you in College Station.
Oh, yes, we sent it. It has yours.
Yeah,
You sent yours earlier.
you guys in College Station are on the ball, so
I mean, yours was one of the first.
I don't know.
And given the memory that
Is there a way to mute out Galveston?
over a day ago.
So that's early.
UN Charter.
All right, we just cut them out.
Next time with that
No?
modification, you find you a foreign one to do the comparison.
Tech guys in College Station, is there a way to mute them out?
Alrighty.
All right, maybe that'll do it. Okay. So anyway, so the point here is that it looks like no significant harm becomes a subset of equitable and reasonable utilization, and it's just an interesting point that is still being debated whether it is an actual subset, because you do have countries like Egypt continuing to argue no significant harm, and all the countries upstream on the Nile River arguing equitable and reasonable utilization. We have a right to the river. We should be allowed to use it. Remember, equitable and reasonable changes over time. We weren't using it before. We now want to use it. It's our equitable right to do so. And Egypt is saying no significant harm. And so this is where we are stuck right now in the Nile, and there's a few other rivers that we're stuck on in the same kind of situation. So looking back to our case studies.
Have you heard of that term called hydrohegemony, where it's like
Yes.
I came across that term while looking up stuff for my paper, and because my paper is going to be over the Jordan River Basin, and so I was looking at Israel and the Palestine conflict right now, and they're having the same exact problem and what I've come across is that Israel doesn't even really need all of this water, because it doesn't even the agriculture isn't a huge part of it, a part of their GDP, but they're taking all this water from Palestine just to assert basically their dominance, and have coerced Syria and Lebanon, I believe, into just doing what it says. And they have all these joint committees or whatever that are more for domination than cooperation. So I don't know.
Well, I will tell you, you're talking to someone who was born in Israel, so I will be very careful how I respond here.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No, absolutely. Hey, I will take this out. No, not at all. So I just want to let you know that my response you've got to maybe take with a grain of salt. So you don't have to believe anything I say at this point.
Okay.
But it's an interpretation, and there are scholars, Palestinian and non-Palestinian scholars, who argue exactly what you say. That it's not a legal issue, it's a hydrohegemony, meaning that it's a power issue. Israel has the power, and it's controlling the water, not based on any kind of legal rights, but based on the fact that it has the authority and the power. From the other side of the argument, Israel has no control over Syria or Lebanon. It has a treaty with Jordan on allocating the water, and Jordan, I don't think, would argue that it was coerced into that treaty. Israel does not have an agreement with the Palestinians. They do control the water to a considerable extent. The agricultural point you made, that it's not a large percent of their economy, well, so the alternative is that Israel would then not grow its own agriculture and therefore import it. And the concern that Israel has said why they don't want to do that is because then they become dependent on another country for their food. So, and this is the same argument with Israel being dependent on the Jordan River, and has been for so many years, and now why they've gone to desalination. They don't want to be dependent on water coming out from outside. So there's a lot of truth in what you say, but there's a lot of controversy in what you say, and you have to be very careful about it, how you characterize it.
Yeah,
From a legal point of view, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, it's just all the, perspectives that I've come across are all from the Palestinian side, so you don't really see Israel's side as much, because they're kind of the bad guy according to a lot of sources.
Yeah.
And so you don't really see why Israel is doing what it's doing. And then now that you say it like that, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, if you want, feel free to send me an email, and I'll send you some academic, not Israeli type of arguments, but some more of academic arguments supporting the either the Israeli side or more of a mainstream side. I'm happy to try to help. But from a legal point of view, I would you have the hydrohegemony issue, which is really challenging. Israel is the 900-pound gorilla in this region. They just are. But from a legal point of view, we have a problem with the Palestinians because they don't have a formal state, and there's a question of whether they can have rights under international law, because only states have rights under international law. There's also a question, well, if they do have rights, what are those rights in relation to Israel? And this is the question of the no significant harm and the equitable and reasonable utilization. And that's where I think you have to base your arguments as the legal arguments. The hegemony arguments put the legal arguments aside and say either one or both countries are ignoring the law and they're just using brute force, which may be the case. And it may be the case, the same thing on the Mekong. And probably the same thing on in the Nile Basin, at least up until recently, where Egypt was exerting its influence on the entire basin. So you have a legal argument, but you also have more of a political argument. That's the hegemony argument. Anything else? This is a really good point. All right. Well, I'm gonna stop here. I think today was really heavy sort of legal analysis type stuff, and where you take a word like equitable and try to dissect it, and that's what lawyers tend to do, because you have to figure out what exactly it means, either in a treaty or in court. And I'm hoping that all of you guys, when you write your papers, when you research your papers, will think in some of these terms. If there's a treaty or what the international law that might be applicable, how would you apply it to your particular situation, your case study, your scenario, and so on. Any questions, any comments, anything? All right, guys, we'll see you next week. Thanks.